I now hand over to Sir Angus. We're all looking very much forward to this year's UBS lecture.
Thank you very much, Joachim, for that very generous introduction. I've been looking forward to this for some time. I was hoping to join you in reality, but I'm afraid we have to put up with this, and I will do my best. So I'm going to talk about inequality and the future of capitalism. And a good question to ask oneself is, why is inequality indeed a problem in modern capitalism? Well, it's clear that people think it is, and people care about it, though one of the things that's become clear as I think about this is different people have very different ideas of what it is that bothers them, or what indeed inequality is. Here are some quotes. President Obama referred to it as the defining challenge of our time. Another quote from him: a few dozen individuals control the same amount of wealth as the poorest half of humanity. That's not an exaggeration, that's a statistic. I really like that quote. Many argue that we should do something about it, though the we in this public policy, as always, is not really very well defined. Dan Riffle, who's the policy advisor for AOC, has this quote about every billionaire is a policy failure, and goes on to say the bigger Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates slices of the pie are, the smaller everybody else's slices of the pie are going to be. It's hard to disagree with that, at least as far as pies are concerned, but is it really true about incomes or well-being? The issue here, of course, is whether Jeff Bezos is hurting us in getting rich or not. Bernie Sanders says, I don't think that billionaires should exist. That's a similar quote. Similar concern in other countries, in Britain, where inequality has always been more of a concern than in the United States. But when economists react to this, they tend to go to the data. They go to the data on income inequality, and they get things that are not so obvious. So here's a graph for the United States. This is the Gini coefficient of income inequality. It's pre-tax income inequality, but post-tax is not very different. And you can see this fairly standard pattern. There was nothing until the 1970s. You then get rapid growth through the late 70s and the 80s. There's a measurement change here, which is always very important to keep in mind, because measuring income inequality is not the easiest thing in the world. And then there's a somewhat slower growth through the 90s, and little change post-2008. And that's important because much of the animosity about inequality and the worries about inequality are post-2008. If you go to Britain, and this is an IFS graph here, Institute for Fiscal Studies, you can see that here's the 90-10 ratio and the Gini coefficient, which track each other. And you can see that while during Mrs. Thatcher's prime ministership, there was a large increase in the Gini coefficient, there's been almost none since. And indeed, you could argue that it's been coming down. And that tends to lead people to say, well, inequality isn't really a problem. You're worrying about nothing. Well, the other thing, of course, about capitalism is that it's brought great prosperity. And that's always something that's worth, when people are just simply attacking capitalism. We have to remember that, the now rich countries in which most of us live would not have gotten to where they are without a capitalist system of some sort. In the last 50 years, in the recently poor countries like India, China, and others. And so if you put these things together, it's bringing great prosperity to large chunks of the world. Income inequality in the rich countries is not really going up. So what on earth is wrong? And why is the US polarized to the point where we actually, realistically, I think today, are fearing for democracy and fearing for civil unrest? So unequal is something. Britain perhaps less so, but the Brexit divisions are real and troubling, and in many ways are parallel to what's going on in the US. and a much wider rise of populism and a fall in the trust, and sharp decline in trust in democracy in many countries around the world. So I shall argue that inequalities are really important. They have a lot to do with all of this, but not the Gini coefficient or even the share of the top 1%, and that I will argue that other divisions should get a lot more attention. It's worth having a brief detour into what philosophers say about this. Philosophers, of course, don't agree among themselves either, but they tend to all be concerned with deprivation or with poverty and with the duty to help do something about that. They're much less concerned with inequality in and of itself, though there are clearly divisions here. And one statement that you often hear is that what legitimate concern do I have if you have more than I do? Why is your having more than I have in itself a matter of legitimate moral and ethical concern? Of course, there's an instrumental question here. You might use your wealth to harm me in some way, but that's not an inherent issue, and it's a possible outcome of inequality, and presumably society can take action to stop it. So that if you're using your wealth to harm me, I and my friends should be able to get together and prevent you from doing that. I'll come back to that question. It's a very important one. Egalitarians see a virtue in equality in of itself. And of course, at the same time, they recognize that people won't work or invest or innovate if equality is guaranteed. And so a task for egalitarians has been to work out a policy that balances the two. And many distinguished economists have worked on how to do so, like Jim Mirrlees, like Tony Atkinson, devoted much of their lives to those questions. And there's another approach, though, which is called relational egalitarianism, that is associated with the philosopher Elizabeth Anderson, that I find very attractive, at least. And here's a quote from her. The proper negative aim of egalitarian justice is to end oppression, which by definition is socially imposed. Its proper positive aim is not to ensure that everybody gets what they morally deserve, but to create a community in which people stand in relations of equality to others. It's something to do with the organization of society and the feeling that an extremely unequal society may make that sort of relational equality impossible. And I think that gets much closer to the heart of the matter. Now, say a few words about wealth. Wealth is much more unequal than income in all societies, largely because differences in income persist and accumulate over time. And if you want to think, it's often useful to be concrete. So here is a list of the richest Americans: Bezos, Gates, Buffett, Ellison, another Ellison, Zuckerberg. Sorry, they're not two Ellisons, that's a typo. Zuckerberg, the Waltons, who are Walmart, Ballmer, who co-founded Microsoft, Page and Brin from Google, and Bloomberg. And then there's a bunch more Waltons, then the last remaining of the Koch brothers, and then Mackenzie Bezos and Adelson, not much further below. If you look at Britain, it's a little bit different. I always thought the Queen was the richest person in Britain, but that turns out not to be true, or it may be true modulo valuation problems. But the Duke of Westminster, who's a great landholder, is number 10 on that list. And there are a bunch of other creators, retail and chemicals, but there's also heiresses and wealth from the breakup of the Soviet Union. And the rest of the world are Arnault, Ortega, Carlos Slim, Betancourt Myers, and Russian oligarchs. So people come about their wealth in a range of different ways. The thing that's most distinguished about the American list is that these are what you might call makers, people whose innovations have changed our lives. Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, Walmart, and Cisco, for instance. So that's important to keep in mind when you're thinking about punitive or confiscatory actions against those people. Many of these people benefited many, though of course we're increasingly worried about the possibility that they may actually be hurting many today. And so there's of course a sequence here which has some generalizability to it, that many of these makers become takers, once good, and then turn bad. So one of the truths, I think, and there's lots of ways of demonstrating this various different ways, is that capitalism does indeed generate inequality. It's sort of in its genes. We can't have the benefits without risking the cost, so we must regulate it somehow, and that, of course, is not straightforward. I give a little example here. Think of capitalism as a casino, and each bet is a project that might be profitable or might not, a new startup or something. Each player puts up $1. They get $1.20 if the coin is heads, and they get $1. They get the dollar back. If the coin is tails, so the expected profit is either what you get is 0.2 or nothing, and the average is 0.1. So everybody has the same starting stake, $1,000, and faces the same odds. Over enough plays, heads come up half the time, so after 1,000 players, each player on average, or can expect, $100 gain. But the total number of successes for each player get more and more unequal over time. I don't have time to do this, but maybe the best way to demonstrate this is just to make a little code on your computer and just watch how far apart the two people get in terms of their total profits. That's how capitalism works. Another good way of thinking about this is think back to all the people you went to school with, how relatively equal you were then and how relatively unequal you are today. At least for those of you who are old enough to not just have graduated from high school. Of course, if you think of inheritance, this process can go on perpetually and perhaps even forever. So how can we stop this genetic consequence of capitalism generating inequality? How can we tame it? And of course, we need some sort of social insurance, taxing the rich, income, wealth, inheritance taxes, providing a safety net, and making sure the winners don't get to cheat at the casino by setting the odds in their favor. So it has to be regulated. So we're back to regulation again. So here's a sort of personal point of view, which is that I think if people get rich in the public interest, it's not a problem. I don't think there's anything inherently bad about that inequality. And indeed, historically, progress often brought inequality, with a few people benefiting first and then other people afterwards. The concern is about what it enables people, rich people, to do via politics, or if they harm me somehow, like the big tech companies using my data. And creative destruction and disruption is the essence of economic growth and innovation, as Schumpeter, the great Austrian economist, wrote about. And the problem, of course, is these innovators tend to want to pull up the ladders behind them, turning from being benefactors to what Teddy Roosevelt called malefactors of great wealth. Google is a good example. It used to sneer at lobbying. We do no evil. We don't need lobbying. And today it's the largest corporate lobbyist in DC, spending $22 million in 2018. So the trick is somehow to stop.
Can you hear me?
Hello? Can I go ahead? The trick is to stop this and allow the next generation of disruptors to come online. Many people think we need better antitrust enforcement, especially in America, as was the case a century ago. But high rates of taxes, especially wealth taxes, risk stopping this process on which we all depend. So I'm going to talk about something that I think really is bothering people and is very distressing in the US today. And it's inequality around education. Life and death are splitting us by education, not spreading wealth or income inequality. And I want to talk about this work that I've been doing with Case over the last 5 years or so. In the US, the BA is increasingly separating people by earnings, by labor force participation, by marriage rates, by out-of-wedlock childbearing, by fertility rates, by pain, by disability, by loneliness, by church-going, and by early mortality. Meaning if you split people into people who have a BA and people who don't, good side of all these things are happening on one side and bad things on the other side. All of these are deteriorating for people without a 4-year college degree. So capitalism in America is working for those with a BA, which is only 1/3 of the adult population, but not for the 2/3 majority. And I want to show you some pictures of this process. The political philosopher, Michael Sandel, has a new book called The Tyranny of Merit, in which he talks about esteem and dignity. The arguments which we also echo in our book is that self-made people tend to discount the role of luck in their success and overstate the role of their own effort, which is often considerable. They can be contemptuous of those who did not successfully climb the educational ladder. After all, they had their chance but blew it. Or in the immortal words of Hillary Clinton, they are deplorables. Those who did not achieve, thinking of the other side of this divide, tend to believe that the system is rigged against them, which is partly true. What we often call opportunity hoarding by the well-educated, pulling up the ladders behind them. And what's more is in a time of great inequality, there are huge incentives to cheat and to rig the rules. And the less educated also share to some extent self-contempt that indeed they themselves might have been to blame, not a very comfortable position to be in. So a system that started off as equal opportunity for all, doing away with the hereditary status and location of good jobs, has turned into a poisonous caste system. Michael Sandel's book is terrific about this, or go back to 1958 and read Michael Young, who invented the term meritocracy. In Sandel's word, the BA degree in the United States has become a condition of dignified work and of social esteem. You get neither of those without a BA degree. Let me show you then some pictures to justify what I just said. This is the employment to population ratio from 1980 through to 2020. The lines, the heavy lines, sorry, let me get this right. The light gray lines are people with BAs. The black lines are for people without a BA, the heavy lines are men, and the broken lines are women. So what you can see is that there's been some decline even for people with BAs, but the exit out of the labor force for men over the last 40 years and for women since 2000 has been confined to those without a BA. So they're just not there anymore. If you look at what's happened to their median real wages, these are for men aged 25 to 54 with less than a 4-year degree. Once again, you get this 40-year decline. So, you know, in good times, the wages go up a bit, but then in bad times, they go down. And then in the good times, they never get back to the height of where they were. So, you know, before the pandemic in the United States and the Trump administration saying how wonderful wages were doing and how ordinary people were seeing these big increase in wages, even at the peak of that, they were lower than at any time during the 1980s. You see the employment population ratio, which you've already seen, but this ratchet is a very important effect, once again, that during recessions, people get shaken out of jobs, they come back, but they never get back to where they were before. So it's this slowly ratcheting decline in labor market attachment and in wages for people with less than a 4-year degree. These are marriage rates, and on the left are for people with a BA. It's by birth cohorts. Sorry, on the left are people with less than a BA, on the right, people with a BA. And you can see that, you know, this is never married, so that tends to decline with age, obviously. But what you can see is that for the people with a BA, there are no cohort effects here, whereas the people without a BA, the younger cohorts, are less likely ever to get married at any given age. This is one of many slides on pain. This is back, neck, or joint pain in the past 3 months. And once again, you see the same thing. If pain goes up with age, which is on the horizontal axis here, I can tell you that's true. But there are no cohort effects for people with a BA, whereas people with less than a BA, the younger cohorts have more pain at any given age than the older cohorts do. Here's the deaths of despair that Anne and I have been writing about. And again, BA on the left, BA on the right, less than BA on the left. And you can see that essentially, once again, each birth cohort, each successive cohort is having more and more deaths, and the deaths rise with age. For people with a BA, there are very small cohort effects. So these people are not only experiencing pain, not getting married, they're out of the labor force, they're killing themselves by drugs, by alcohol, and suicide in large numbers. And then this is a new graph. This shows life expectancy at 25. Obviously, you can't divide people up by a BA or not when they're born, because you don't know whether they're going to get a BA. The middle line is for the whole US population, and you see from 1990 the steady rise, and it actually attained its peak in 2014. It fell for 3 years. There was a slight tick up in 2018, which is last year that we have data for. But you can see that people with a BA, the life expectancy, this is sometimes called adult life expectancy, continues to increase. Whereas for people without a BA, this actually peaked in 2010 or 2012 and has been falling ever since. That's partly deaths of despair. A lot of it's to do with the fact that for these people without a BA, the long-term established decline in heart disease has stopped and actually reversed itself. You can see there's some slowing down too for people with a BA, but it's the people without a BA for whom this beneficial process is now completely turned around. So, you know, why? What has gone wrong? Is this a feature of American capitalism or capitalism more broadly? So here are some of the things that have gone wrong. American pharma was allowed to addict and kill people for money. Other countries, European countries, simply do not allow this. They use the same drugs, but they're not allowed into the community in large numbers. Healthcare in America costs 18% of national income. That's 6% more than you guys in Switzerland, which is the second highest percentage of GDP in healthcare, even though in Switzerland you have 5 years more life expectancy than Americans. That 6% of GDP in America would be $1 trillion a year. And that's a reasonable estimate of the waste in our healthcare system. That's a huge amount. That's 150% of the total we spend on the military, which many people think is an incredibly wasteful expenditures. And worse than that, it's mostly financed by what is essentially a poll tax on workers in employment, which destroys employment opportunities and decreases wages, and bears a lot of the responsibility for the graph that you saw a minute ago, where real wages and labor force participation have been falling. But it also chucks people out of good jobs in large corporations and sends them off to work in outsourced firms either abroad or at home. Many of these domestic firms are not very good places to work, so you lose good jobs for bad jobs. The system of enormous rip-off theft, if you like, is held in place by FELF. There are 5 healthcare lobbyists in Washington for every member of Congress. It's also true that antitrust is arguably much too weak. This is what stops makers turning into takers, and that's been a failure of thought as well as of policy, I think. Chicago-style law and economics emphasizes efficiency, pay no interest in distribution, and indeed a multi-year well-funded effort has created a pro-business judiciary, including the Supreme Court. Judge Richard Posner had a huge effect on this. If you read his book on justice, he thinks that justice is wealth maximization, and so there's really no concern at all with no room for worry about inequality in such a system. And that's the system that increasingly we have. So this is a large apparatus that's distributing upwards from the whole population to a relatively few well-off people. So what should we do? Well, there's only 2 lines of thought here, and I've been much influenced here by Eric Posner, Richard Posner's son. But my argument all along has been we don't need to get rid of capitalism. We need to regulate it better. We need to restore competition. We've come to believe in this sort of fundamental ability of markets to do everything, which is just plain wrong. And the idea that healthcare can provide healthcare markets can provide healthcare, is absurd. And a lot of the bad things that are happening now are as a result of that belief. We need to fix antitrust to stop big tech taking over potential competitors. We need to reorient the courts and bring them back to a belief in distribution as well as efficiency. And we need something to do on campaign finance reform rules and lobbying. We need to eliminate tax havens. Now, that's been sort of my line. We need to repair capitalism, and not, as people on the left would argue, which is have much higher taxes. Now, the argument that Eric Puzda has been making is that this might be too much of a lift against heavy resistance. The society is just too unequal now to make that possible. And it might be possible to build a coalition to simply impose higher income and wealth taxes and for redistribution in the right direction, downwards instead of upwards. Now, immediately, you know, the objection to this is these people are stealing stuff. The right way to deal with someone who's stealing stuff is to outlaw the theft and not by taxing its proceeds. But it just may not be possible to police. If the thieves have corrupted the police and changed the rules, we may simply have to make it less attractive by taxing it and less well-funded. The risk here is of stifling innovation, or at least of limiting it. You know, the sort of wealth tax that Thomas Piketty argues for would essentially force, for instance, Jeff Bezos to give up Amazon in order to pay these very high levels of wealth tax over a few years. Now, they think that's fine. I think many people think it's rather a good thing to have Jeff Bezos running Amazon, and he's been very good at it. But that's the sort of division here. So I want to end with one of my favorite quotes, and I will tell you in a minute who it comes from, but you can guess in the meantime. This says, but the cruelest of our revenue laws, revenue laws meaning taxation, this quote is a quarter of a millennium old. But the cruelest of our revenue laws, I will venture to affirm, are mild and gentle in comparison with some of those which the glamour of our merchants, glamour meaning charm really, of our merchants and manufacturers, actually you think of glamour as being lobbying, which the lobbying of our merchants and manufacturers has extorted from the legislature for the support of their own absurd and oppressive monopolies. Like the laws of Draco, these laws may be said to be all written in blood. For those of you who don't know who Draco was an Athenian legislator who reformed the laws in a very simple way, which is that all crimes were punishable by death. And so the word draconian in English comes from that. So this denunciation of rent-seeking is much worse than taxation, of course, comes from my countryman, Adam Smith, in The Wealth of Nations. So I'm going to stop there and hand back to Joachim, and I'm happy to take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Angus, for that brilliant lecture on an extremely important topic. So before we open up the Q&A, let me explain to the audience how we're going to bring your questions into our forum today. So you can go to menti.com, and when you enter the code 828717, you can ask your questions, and we will pick a selection of these to put to Sir Angus. Now, while you actually do this, or some of you may have already done so, I will use the organizer's privilege and ask Angus the first question myself. So one thing that was very much in my mind while you spoke, you brilliantly showed how health trends have worsened, especially for the uneducated in America. And this is partly related, of course, to changes in inequality, but also to the way in which healthcare is actually administered. And for many years, I've been a great fan of your letters from America, which you write regularly for the Royal Economic Society. And in one of these, I think it must have been in 2005, you actually describe some of the absurdities and peculiarities of the American healthcare system and how hard it is to even figure out what an operation costs and so forth. And that begs the question, how much of what you describe here is peculiar to the American situation with its very unusual type of healthcare system for a rich country? And how much of that is, in your view, a broader malaise of capitalism affecting many countries or about to affect many countries going forward?
I think that's a really, really good question, and it's something that everyone has to think about and every country has to figure out for itself. I think the problems, the risks are generic, and there's no better source for them than, one of the greatest economists of the 20th century, Ken Arrow, who wrote a paper in the American Economic Review, I think in the 60s, on healthcare and why the market solution to healthcare would be intolerable. And what he identified there were two of the most important forces, the adverse selection, which would destroy insurance markets, and the moral hazard. And we tend to think of moral hazard as being a moral hazard that if you're insured, you won't look after your health and bad things will happen. But I think the biggest problem with moral hazard is on the producer's side, that we've got ourselves a system in America where producers are basically allowed to choose how much you buy. And of course, if you set up incentives that way, it's going to get incredibly expensive. The producers are going to make you buy a lot of stuff, and they're going to charge you enormous prices for it. And so it's something really that Arrow predicted a long time ago, that you just can't do it this way. And so there's really two things you have to do with any healthcare system in the world, and different countries do it in different ways, which is you basically have to get comprehensive coverage, preferably from birth. So basically what you'd like to do is every person, as soon as they're born, is in the healthcare system, whether they do anything or their parents do anything or not. And secondly, you've got to have price control. And price control in some form or another is necessary to stop the doctors and hospitals and the device manufacturers just doing a giant hijack on the economy, which is what's happened in America. And of course, that's been routinely denounced in America. Death panels, do you remember? All that sort of stuff. So just to answer your question, the problems are generic, but the solution is not to pretend you're having a market system. And of course, we're not really having a market system because it's all regulated and politicians are meddling in it and everybody else is meddling in it, and you just have a mess. And it's a mess down which we're wasting at least $1 trillion a year. And that's really sucking the lifeblood out of the economy.
So thank you very much. We have a lot of questions, and I will try to do my best to pick a range so that we get to hear your thoughts on a number of different topics. One question that came up here is, if the market, the free operation of the free market, creates these huge inequalities, should we perhaps address them by rich individuals and rich countries actually donating some of the proceeds of this lottery or casino, as you called it, through philanthropy and development aid?
I'm not a fan of that solution. And what I'm, in my previous book, The Great Escape, in the last chapter, I wrote about some of the problems that come with philanthropic aid to developing countries, at least. But that has been much broadened in a number of recent books. There's one by someone whose name I can never produce called Winners Take All. And there's another one by Rob Reich at Stanford called Just Philanthropy. And, these are not, there's a lot of bad stuff associated with that. It's very unclear why we should hand over big chunks of public policy to people who got incredibly rich, in many cases by cutting corners or doing bad things. And actually, something that Larry Summers likes to say, and I would like to endorse, these large corporations would do very well to start paying their taxes. That would be a really good start. And we can worry about philanthropy after that. And you know, these big tech corporations in many countries are not paying any taxes at all. There's huge tax havens, and you know, so that it's really impossible to run a society if your most successful people won't pay any taxes.
Yep, and that's actually one of the questions that we have in the chat here. So somebody is asking, given that these big tech companies are very good at not paying taxes, what can be done about it, since there are all these offshore centers where taxation can be optimized?
Well, I think that you know, Piketty and Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zucman have written very well about this. We do need better international cooperation to help shut this down. And also, you know, the sort of reforms that are so hard to make happen, in which American politicians basically connive to help people not pay taxes, is this loop I was talking about, where, you know, these companies get incredibly rich, they pour money into supporting politicians, into lobbying, and then they don't have to pay any taxes. But, you know, it's sort of like the opposite side. I think it was Nikki Caldor long ago who said you can't get development unless you have a social contract between the government and the state, and the government and the governed, in which the governed pay their taxes and the state provides goods and services. We've now got that in the richest country in the world, or the richest large country in the world, where people are refusing to pay their taxes and the state is sort of falling apart.
Excellent, thank you so much. There's one question that would like to probe you a little bit on the analogy between capitalism and the casino, by basically saying, you know, it's not a casino, it's not all random, and shouldn't we compare it with any alternative capitalism, with any alternative mode of organizing production and sharing the proceeds of production, which then would actually imply, if you compare it, say, with socialism, that any alternative will not just reduce equality, but make everyone poorer.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, a lot of people have written about this, and it is you know, a long debate about innovation versus distribution, and whether you can achieve a just distribution without choking off the innovation. And I think that debate right now is very lively. There's a lot of people contributing to it. Philippe Aguillon, in particular, who has a new book coming out about creative destruction. And, you know, he, I think, like me, would, you know, one of the people who was on my billionaires list is Carlos Slim. And Carlos Slim is a Mexican who got rich by being given telephone contracts by the government, which made him immensely wealthy, whereas most, if not all, of the people on the American list did actually do things that helped all of us. And it may be that these people would have done that without any incentives, without the possibility of getting fabulously rich. I rather suspect not. And it's not just them, it's all the stuff they had to create along the way to make that happen. So, I mean, I do think that there really is a lot to worry about abolishing incentives altogether, or not altogether, but diminishing the incentives. The one area where I think it's completely intolerable is the pharma industry, which is getting huge incentives and has no control at all. I mean, it's sort of like we're in a situation where we pay for the innovation and they get the profits of it. And a lot of that is supported by public institutions like you know, the National Institutes of Health and universities and so on. And then somehow when the thing gets close to being usable, the profits go somewhere else. And this is, of course, a very interesting topic right now, as pharma companies are producing vaccines for COVID-19. And, you know, there's a chance that the pharma companies will come out of this having sort of rescued themselves, or they might come out of this having done just exactly the opposite. And I don't have any very strong idea of how that's going to work out in the end.
Excellent. One question here is, aren't we looking at a time frame that's just too short? Shouldn't we judge the performance of economic systems like capitalism, not perhaps over decades or even centuries, instead of focusing so much on what seemed to be relatively short-term fluctuations in the last few years or so? And isn't there a lot of sort of self-regulation built into the democratic process, where even in the United States in the 1930s, but also in the 19th century, there's inevitably a backlash against the monopolies. Eventually the regulators step in, and there's a much greater degree of restriction coming down the road as soon as one of these monopolies basically exceeds what is a reasonable degree of market power.
That's the good outcome, and that I think is entirely possible. And in our book, Anne and I do draw a parallel with what happened at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, in which we lived in a time of enormous inequality and where politics worked. And, you know, Woodrow Wilson was elected as president. We got a series of constitutional amendments, including the constitutional amendment that permitted the income tax, constitutional amendment that allowed women to vote, the constitutional amendment that abolished the direct election by state legislatures, or sorry, it allowed the direct election of senators, which otherwise didn't happen. And the other amendment at that time, of course, was prohibition, which didn't work out so well, but was thought to be an instrument of removing oppression, especially from women. So we got all this reform, and then, you know, things went on okay for 50 years maybe, and then it turned around and we got now. So I hope it's true that both intellectually and legally, we will change our system to the point where we'll pull in these monopolies. But, you know, read today's paper. We've got a president who's refusing to accept the results of the election. The vast majority of one of the main parties is supporting him. They're not actually saying abolish democracy, but they're conniving at a president who would like to do that. And some of them, even quite thoughtful senators, there was a quote the other day from Senator Mike Lee of Utah, who's very interested in social policy in lots of ways, who said that democracy is not of any inherent worth of its own. Democracy is a tool to bring peace and prosperity, and it's entirely instrumental. And once people start saying things like that, I think we're in deep trouble. So, you know, one story is this is self-correcting over a long period of time. Another story is that we're spinning out of control and it won't correct. I'm hoping the former is correct.
Thank you. A question that came up, you point to this change in economic inequality, but a good part of that inequality is actually inherited. So there are people, of course, who create in order to become rich, but a significant share of wealth is created by choosing your parents wisely. Is there a case for much higher rates of inheritance tax, for example?
There's certainly a case for inheritance tax. We have very little inheritance tax here now. And, you know, that's the result, on the one hand, of, you know, rich people lobbying senators and congressmen, not all Republicans, Democrats do. Milton Friedman played a huge role in that. There's a wonderful, not wonderful, but horrific statement about Milton Friedman saying the death tax is the worst sort of tax there could ever be. And, you know, one story I haven't really harped on here, but I think about a lot, is the huge role that economists and economic philosophy played in getting to where we are right now. I mean, you know, you had Hayek leading a counter-revolution against Keynesian statism. And then various very deep thinkers, mostly at the University of Chicago, sort of pulling apart the Keynesian consensus on the role of the state, on the role of regulation, and so on. And, you know, a lot of, I think those ideas are incredibly important to where we've gotten now. We've got to find some better way. And, you know, the inheritance tax would be my first choice, along with closing tax haven.
Okay, on the topic of possible levers to get us from a bad place to a better place, one of the questions asked here is, what about this reorientation that some corporations at least pay lip service to, away from an exclusive focus on shareholder value, trying to take into account the interests of more of their stakeholders? Is that one of those self-healing forces at the heart of capitalism in your view?
I think there's a lot of interest in that right now and a lot of good work being done, and people are studying the German system, which seems to have worked fairly well by having workers on the. But I'm a bit skeptical because I'm worried that it will turn into a public relations exercise without actually much bite. And there are two things, one of which I've already said, which is before corporations start reorienting themselves to be stakeholder corporations, it would be great if they paid their taxes. Beyond that, we've had decades of anti-union legislation in the United States, and unions were one of the mechanisms whereby firms were responsible to one set of stakeholders, which were the workers in the firm. They produced higher wages for their members. They produced higher wages in the same industry for non-members. They also played an invaluable role in monitoring safety and health violations. So for instance, there are laws against having unsafe workplaces, but the feds, don't really have enough manpower to check all those, and the unions used to report those and keep them under control. Now there are hardly any private sector unions left anymore. The unions were also a great producer of social capital. Bob Putnam's guy that was bowling alone was bowling alone in a union hall, and now the union hall isn't there anymore. Presumably there's not even one guy bowling anymore. So, I think there are things we could do before exploring this move towards more stakeholder capitalism, which I'm not against. I just find it a bit fuzzy, and it seems to me there are things that one could do before that.
And it probably comes in different flavors, one voluntary and maybe with less of an impact than if governments, as the German government does, prescribing representation of workers, right? Which then changes the bargaining. One question asks about the implications of what you shared with us today in relation to climate change. So isn't there another dimension of inequality just waiting to explode, where people in poor countries will suffer the consequences of all the carbon emitted by today's rich countries, where the rich countries can easily build seawalls and the poor will drown. The rich people get air conditioning if the summers get too hot, and the poor will die of heat stroke.
Yes, I agree with that. I don't really have any insight in what to do about it. I mean, if you've got corporations in this country who are plundering their own people, it's even harder to ask them to stop plundering people who don't even have any say in the democracy in which these firms exist. So, and it's interesting too that in the second of the two debates between Biden and Trump, it's clear that Trump's pledge to, in the end, eliminate the oil industry cost him an enormous number of votes. So this is a really tough issue.
So as I was going through your recent work, I saw something in your 2017, I think, Brookings paper that I thought was interesting. So you mainly highlighted how the health crisis in the US has increased inequality, but there's one dimension in which it seems to have done almost the opposite, which is that for the less educated and less financially successful, there's a declining gap between African Americans and whites in terms of their mortality outcomes, I think pretty much across all age groups. And I wondered if you had anything to say about this, because of course it's the wrong type of equality when the white population suffers from the same extremely high mortality rates as the African American population.
Yeah, so let me start by saying what's very important to remember is that African Americans have higher mortality rates at all ages than whites do. And that's even true conditional in education, so that Black Americans with a BA degree have higher mortality than white Americans with a BA degree, and also without a BA degree. That said, what has happened, which is quite remarkable, and we have a new paper which is not being circulated yet on this, is that the huge racial gaps in life expectancy or mortality from 20 years ago have now largely, if not actually not totally, but largely been replaced by educational gaps. So the life expectancy at 25, say, of whites with a BA is now much closer to the adult life expectancy of blacks with a BA than it is to either whites without a BA or blacks without a BA. So whites still do better than blacks, conditional on education, but that gap is enormously closed. And for me, actually, I think it's been true in American society that the situation of African Americans has in many ways greatly improved over the last 20 or 30 years. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why, at least up until about 2013, the deaths of despair seem to have been confined to white non-Hispanics. They've now spread to African Americans too over the last 7 or 8 years, is that there's been this offsetting effect for African Americans of greater esteem, greater access to good jobs, greater access to education. And at the same time, as many writers have argued, at least some whites are suffering or feel that they're suffering from the withdrawal of the white privilege that they've had for so many years.
Yep, the wrong type of equality, if you will. If I can perhaps close with one last question before we need to wrap up. You touched on this already, but all of this, doesn't it raise some questions about the very survival of democracy going forward, given the levels of inequality we see, the extent to which money maps into voice, especially in the United States and some Western European countries by now as well?
Oh, sorry, I heard you, but I didn't quite get the question.
Oh, the question is, isn't the rise in inequality sooner or later going to imperil democracy as we've known it in the last 100, 150 years because of the extent to which influence can be bought, both by corporations and individuals, especially in the US, but also in Europe?
Yeah, well, if I can quote your previous question, we seemed to get out of this the last time. And, you know, at the end of the 19th century, and perhaps we can get out of it again. And yeah, I mean, I think it's very, very worrisome. And but you know, I think these divisions of esteem and the divisions. Well, let me back off that again. I think the financial crisis was incredibly important because, you know, a lot of very rich people harmed the rest of us, and were never punished for it. Indeed, in many cases, richly rewarded for it. And I think that totally undermined what, for many people, was a fairly sympathetic view of capitalism making money. But I think the other thing that's happened is this tyranny of merit, this sense that 2/3 of the population are deplorables and do not deserve or carry any esteem, is incredibly dangerous. Similar divisions in Britain. It's very hard to run a democracy when more than half the people feel that that democracy is not doing anything for them. I think there are recent Pew polls showing about 2/3 of less educated Americans, people without a BA, think it's a complete waste of time to vote. And in fact, if that was overcome in the last election, it was because they had someone who they had someone to vote for who they thought would break the system, and they're totally happy to see the system broken. And many of those Trump voters must feel that democracy is not worth anything to them, because voting for Trump is a vote against democracy.
Thank you so much, Sir Angus. I'm afraid we're out of time. You've touched on an enormous range of topics, and you've illustrated one thing that's always been close to our heart at the UBS Center. Economics is not just about nuts and bolts, productivity and GDP. It's touching on many things that are core to the survival of our societies. I would like to thank you very dearly, and I would like to thank the audience for watching. We hope that we've given you some food for thought, and that you will visit us again at our upcoming webinars. We will keep you informed through our newsletter and social media channels. And in the meantime, I invite you to follow the discussions on social media, on Twitter, LinkedIn, or YouTube. And you can find all information on the forum on the UBS Center's website, ubscenter.uzh.ch. And that's all from us in Zurich. Good night and goodbye.